All characters and events in this publication, other than those clearly in the public domain, are fictitious, and any resemblance to real persons, living or dead, is purely coincidental. Copyright 2016 by R.L. Coy. R.L. Coy Books presents The Master of Names by R.L. Coy. Chapter 2. A reading by Jeanette Coy. Chapter 2, Part 2. After a while, Drake said, "Adriana, your son has been found to have magical abilities. He will be leaving in 2 weeks' time." Adriana was surprised. "So, you are the only magic user in Devane?" "Yes," replied Plum. "I am. I have to say I'm a little bit shocked." "Yes, you would be," said Adriana, trying to ignore the day's events. But Plum knew his mother all too well. This news had affected her deeply. After a long silence, Drake began. "The roads are dangerous. Do you have a family sword?" Often families in the land of law would have a family sword or spear that bore their family coat of arms. The first king of Shine used it as a way to identify the families. But nowadays it was more of a formality, harking back to family history. Curiously, Drake's eyes followed Adriana. She did not answer. Instead, she walked over to an old trunk. Removing the grey patchwork quilt that covered it, she lifted the heavy lid and set about removing the old letters, maps, and scrolls. Reaching deep inside, she pulled out a long sword and handed it to Plum. "This is yours now," she said. Plum eyed the old two-handed relic dubiously. "Do I really have to take this thing?" Before Adriana had the chance to respond, Drake interjected. "You will need it. It is a long ride, and we might be stopped by bandits or who knows what else. There are incantations that exist that will make your sword lighter and a good deal shorter and less thick." Drake scratched his beard. "Can I have a look at that sword?" Plum handed over the sword and its scabbard. "This sword has not been used for years, Adriana," Drake said. "It was my grandfather's sword. It has been in the family for as long as I can remember," Adriana explained. Pondering, Drake replied, "Well, it will have to do." Less than impressed, Plum watched on as Drake took out his wand and started to chant. A soft melodic rhythm began, and as it did so, the sword began to levitate. Both Adriana and Plum were speechless, amazed. They watched in wonder as the metal of the blade became as fluid as liquid. Then runes appeared, as though they had been etched into the blade itself. The chanting began to subside, and the sword came back down to rest on the table. "Now, have a hold of that, Plum," Drake said, offering him the hilt of the sword. The boy came forward gingerly, and holding out his hands, Drake handed him the sword. "It's so light," Plum uttered in disbelief. Drake filled with pride over his handiwork. "Yes, your sword is now lighter, but I've kept its full length. It is also indestructible now, impervious to rust, damage, or chipping. I have put a fire enchantment on it, so that when you are close to danger and everything seems to be lost, it will release a powerful burst of fiery energy to inflict harm. It will destroy your enemies and let you make a quick getaway." Plum could not keep the smile from his face. "Oh, thank you, Drake." "You are most welcome. Oh, just one more thing," continued Drake. "Have you thought about a name for the sword?" "A name?" said Plum, scratching his head. Nodding, Drake replied, "Yes, a name. All wizards and warriors have names for their weapons. What are you going to give yours?" Plum thought for a moment. He had never before considered himself to be either a wizard or a warrior. But looking at Drake, he saw that he was deadly serious and needed to respond, even though he always thought that naming inanimate objects was daft. Drake's eyes were on him. After a while, Plum said, "I will call it Hairu Tharen." "Which means?" asked Drake. Adriana said, "It means moonlight in Devanian." "Beautiful name," said Drake, as he held out his wand one more time and began to etch Hairu Tharen into the sword. Seeing that Plum and Drake had much to discuss, Adriana said, "It is getting late. I will get us something to eat." She then went over to the stove and began chopping up various vegetables for the dish. As they were sitting down at the table, Drake turned to Plum. "And we will start your sword training tomorrow. I assume you have some skill with the blade?" "Oh, yes, but not very much," Plum said. "I'm only used to killing wolves to keep them away from the sheep, but beyond that, I don't really know." Drake, staring at him for a long while, said, "Very well, we will start your sword training tomorrow, and by the end of 2 weeks, you should be proficient enough to kill the occasional bandit. The rest you will learn at school." Adriana brought the stew to the table, and they all started to eat. The next morning, Plum woke with a start. He was supposed to meet Drake at the wheat fields at 7 a.m. to begin his sword training. But with all the excitement of yesterday, he had overslept. Frantically, Plum threw himself out of bed, pulled on his clothes. There was already some hot oatmeal and milk on the dining room table, with 2 notes. Plum reached for the 2 envelopes. The first one was from Adriana. It read, "I have just gone down to the town centre to sell the grain. I will be back late this evening. Don't wait up for me. With love, Mum." The second was from Drake. It read, "Meet me down in the wheat fields when you're done with breakfast. I will be waiting for you. I have set up a special training area. Don't forget to bring your sword. Drake." Plum quickly gobbled up the remainder of his porridge. He went out into the wheat fields and began to search for Drake. He found Drake over by one of the old stone ruins. It was the very same archway where only days ago they had sat together before the census. But then the whole space had been completely covered in overgrowth. Now it had been cleared, and flour bags filled with grain stood as training dummies. Also, there was a makeshift ring for sparring and a shooting area for target practice. Plum could hardly believe his eyes. It was amazing. As he was looking around, Drake came up behind him and gave him a hard pat on the shoulder. "Like it?" he asked. "Yes, it is very good," said Plum, gaping at what Drake had created, trying to make sense of it all. "Okay then, let's begin," said Drake. "I'm going to teach you some basic sword movements. Today we are going to learn how to parry, which is the art of using your 2-handed weapon as a shield. We will also learn how to predict the opponent's movements. Come on, boy, show me what you've got." Plum looked nervous, but unsheathing Hairu Taren, he took a step forward into the sparring ring. Plum was full of nervous trepidation and stood waiting for Drake to make the first move. "Good. Now my sword," he says, and brandishes his weapon. Drake's sword was shorter than Plum's, with the shine emblem cast on its hilt. The blade was also engraved with runes. Plum also observed that the blade was cast in gold plate, a very costly thing for most smithies to craft. "My blade is called Nightwish," Drake proudly exclaimed. "Now try and rush toward me with your best attack stance." Plum thought for a moment. He was brought back to the time when he used to help his mother go out and hunt the wolves. He gave his loudest scream and ran towards Drake with increasing speed, holding Hairutharen wildly above his head. But Drake was ready for him. He easily parried his blows with very little effort. My, That was a hell of a lot of effort wasted. Now I know you used to kill wolves, but you need to try and be a tad more graceful, a bit less impulsive, and more tactful. Killing bandits is not like killing wolves. They are a lot more intelligent, and if you're not careful, they might outsmart you. Plum shot Drake a dark look, but Drake paid it no mind and continued. Now I am going to teach you how to parry properly. Thugs won't go away at the sight of a crazed lunatic with a sword screaming down the hill at 100 miles an hour. That's ridiculous, he scoffed. Plum looked annoyed at this mockery of his swordcraft. Drake, seeing that he had hit a nerve, held up his hands in supplication and said, I'm not a teacher, lad. You will have to be patient with me. I'm sorry if that came out wrong. Plum, satisfied with his apology, bade him to resume his lesson. Drake began with the basic parry movements. We call it the 1, 2, 3, 4 approach. It goes like this. 1. Raise your sword in an upward motion. 2. Raise your sword in a sideways motion. 3. Raise your sword to the right side horizontally, tilting it. And finally, 4. Tilt your sword in a sideways motion across to the left, always covering your weak spots. If your opponent tries to aim high at your head, he continued, put the blade across your face to prevent them from gaining purchase. And if they try and target the top of your head, raise your sword above your head. This will prevent them from doing any airstrikes. But often these situations are in real time and you don't have much time to react. You have to practice these movements until they are automatic reactions that you don't need to think about. Plum asked with curiosity, What are airstrikes? When the enemy is at a certain height above you, it's a bit hard to explain without a cliff edge. The enemy can run onto the cliff edge and jump off. Drake demonstrated as best as he could, making a jumping movement and slamming his sword onto the ground, and try to slice you in two. This technique is difficult and very dangerous for the attacker to execute properly, without the person being attacked either noticing or being quick enough to avoid the attack. Drake, rubbing his temples, then said, This is why it is not wise to undertake this kind of attack for any reason. It is foolhardy and stupid. Only crazy Asiatic swordsmen use this attack for reasons I do not know. It is difficult to master and hardly worth the bother to teach you at this stage. It is something you will learn at the school. But if you know how to protect against that particular strike, that is more valuable than learning the skill itself. Now, Plum, try the parrying skills for yourself. Drake slowly started to circle around Plum, doing basic sword movements. Plum was applying the 1, 2, 3, 4 technique and found to his surprise that it was useful. After they had finished sparring, Drake said with a satisfied smile, Ah, you seem to get the concept. Good. Let's move on to the next thing. Plum almost collapsed with exhaustion, and throwing Hairutaren to the ground, said, I don't want to do any more of this. I'm too tired. Drake said, You have to do it, Plum. Otherwise I will not be able to take you to the School of Black Shadows. It would be too dangerous, as I have very few escorts with us. 1 or 2 armed men at the most. Then Drake added to himself, Hardly a fitting convoy. With a resigned sigh, Plum got up and pulled Hairutaren out of the ground, beads of sweat coming off his forehead and dripping to the ground. He went over to Drake, who was standing by his 2 creations, the flower bag dummies. Drake said as cheerfully as he could, Come on, Plum, last thing for today. Plum gave him a skeptical look, with eyes burning like hot coals, and then finally, with a hint of annoyance in his tone, said, What are we looking at? Drake, still cheerful, ignoring the tone with the patience of a saint, said, Say hello to my 2 friends. This is Bandit 1, and this is Bandit 2. Plum poised, ready to strike at the dummies with eager anticipation. But before he could attack either of the bandits, Drake held out his finger and waved it in the air. Not like that, he said. Taking a moment, Drake went over to the flower bags. Scratching his stubble, he said, Remember that there is an established etiquette with sword fighting. You use the 1, 2, 3, 4 method for parrying. Now, this is the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 method for offensive strikes. A basic enough routine. But if you can remember this, you can fight even the most experienced brigand. Drake took a fighting stance in front of the 2nd flower bag. This is the strike you must learn. It comes in from the right side. When you are striking the enemy, make sure he is off guard. Otherwise, he can easily block your attack with his sword. Drake demonstrated. 1, he said. Plum watched Drake hit the bag of flour, the blade cutting through the sack like a knife cutting through butter. Then, with the bag already half torn open, he said, 2. He swung again, cutting the other side of the flour bag. 3, he said, and he took a step back and sliced at the bandit dummy's right arm. 4, he chopped off the dummy's makeshift head. He cut the other arm off the dummy, and with satisfaction, he said 5, and he turned to face Plum. And that is the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 method. But that is without the bandit struggling.